It's John Bowden from Rock History Book. Everyone remembers where they were, for the most part, when John Lennon passed away. Many were watching football. It's that cliche about the story. I was watching football. Howard Cosell came on and announced that he was shot, then announced that he had passed away. Everyone was glued to the TV and radios, wanting to find out what had happened, how this could possibly happen, and who did it. Now, in this interview, we have Lori Kay, who was the last person 4 hours before John was killed. She was saying goodbye to him after an afternoon of hanging out with Yoko Ono and John Lennon with the RKO team. She was the last person to ever interview John Lennon. And it's a moment in time that she has a place in history, but she did a lot of work getting there. Even before interviewing John Lennon, she had already talked to Paul McCartney and Linda, George Harrison. In her career, she also interviewed famous Beatles producer George Martin. So she knows her stuff. Her brand new book is Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper. In the description of this video, you'll see links where you can pick it up. Our very interesting interview with the last person to ever talk to John Lennon professionally, Lori Kay, on Rock History Book.
Look at all the books you got.
A little bit crooked too, but
No, this is great. You know what? I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy you're releasing this.
thank you.
Reading the book, this is such an incredible journey you've had. It's a beautiful, the lessons are hard fought, and you've had a hell of a journey.
That's true. I would say that's exactly it. Hell of a journey. Thank you.
You were there in Beatlemania. You were, before, talking to the Beatles and John, this was your era. This was your time.
Since I was a toddler, absolutely.
Yeah. Love the book, by the way. Let's talk about the bug. It's a cliche question. When did you get the bug for music? When did it start? Was it one instant? Was it many?
Music to me was the way to get through being raised by a dysfunctional family. And that started when I was a toddler. I was the first barely talking kid that you can imagine to say, I want a transistor radio. And the reason was I wanted to sleep with it, with the plugs in my ears at night, and listen to top 40 AM stations in Los Angeles that played all the great music that I wanted to hear. Everything back then, from Elvis Presley to Little Richard to eventually the Beach Boys, and then the Beatles. And it was extremely exciting. And I went on with that for years, got off the transistor radio eventually and into my stereo, well, actually into friends' stereos at their house and in their bedrooms before I got mine, and listened to music all the time. And that's what got me through my life. That's what made it so good for me. And being able to listen to the radio and albums and singles was so very exciting. And song lyrics formed my life, basically.
Isn't it interesting if someone would have whispered in your ear during Beatlemania, whispered in your ear and told you about your future, your head would have exploded.
No doubt. And the thing was, I remember so clearly seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and thinking, oh my God, this is amazing. And I just had this feeling in the back of my head, this is my life. And you know what? I was right as a little kid.
It's interesting how there was just, people talk about someone beating the Beatles records, like Drake a few years ago. I think it was number ones or something like that. But the Beatles, again, overstating the obvious, it was such a phenomenon. Just at that one moment, that one show, how the trajectory of music changed in 1964.
They changed the world of music. They changed the world, period, but especially of music. And that was the area that they went through to just make their mark on the world.
Who was that young lady who, tell me about you going back, how would you describe that young girl watching that? Who was she? Who were you then?
Oh, I was as I said, a young girl already aware of the fact that I was being raised by a dysfunctional family, having a lot of problems.
So you were aware of that? You were like, that was a conscious, because sometimes, I hate to interrupt you, but sometimes that comes up. I was just talking to Billy Bob Thornton. He mentioned this, speaking of name dropping, he was talking about the fact that he was aware of it then as it was happening. And he even said, that usually comes later when you start comparing yourself to other people. You go to someone else's house for a sleepover, that kind of thing. But you were aware of it.
I had no father. Not only wasn't my mother married, but I had never met the man who was my father and never did end up meeting him. And my mother lived with her parents for several years and fought with them all the time. Yeah. It was just not a happy relationship. And my mother was obviously treating me as something in her life that she wished wasn't there, unfortunately. And that may have changed slightly over the years. I wish it had. Unfortunately, it didn't really. I was always problematic to her. And therefore, it helped me become a teenage runaway and part from my family when I finally could.
Who was the person outside of, like, before the Beatles? Was there anyone in your life that said, hey, this is good. This is good music here? Who were your teachers in music before you became professional?
The first music I listened to that was really exciting to me and changed my life probably was Alvin and the Chipmunks. I loved them. And then I loved their cartoon show. That animated show years later was amazing, but their music was incredible. And I loved them.
So you were not allowed with John, for instance, to ask any Beatles questions? How did that start? What were the rules going into that?
We were told in advance by Bert Keane, the Warner Brothers Geffen Records exec, who was with us on our RKO team that day for the interview, that we would not be allowed to talk about the Beatles, to bring up John's past. The idea is that we were talking about the present, about the release of Double Fantasy and his wonderful family life. And that was the most important. So even though we were told don't bring it up, which was definitely obvious because I read a bunch of his print interviews that he'd done beforehand, and he seemed to get really pissed off when writers were asking him about that. You know, his responses were not good. And so we didn't ask him about that. And yet he brought it up himself, which was so incredible. So that was cool to have John bring up the Beatles and working with Paul McCartney and meeting Paul and putting the band together. And, you know, it was terrific.
What was it about was it the Playboy interview that scared you because of how John reacted? What was it about that?
It just seemed like he was not really thrilled with the questions that were being asked, that he was kind of upset. And I didn't want that to happen. And I had never been asked not to talk about something in an interview before. That
really?
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody had ever mentioned. I was just given the assignment, you know, scheduled an interview and did it. And they were always great. So,
you know, I found out about the James Taylor thing as well much later, about James being in that universe, you know, because I was, you know, you mentioned Russ Kunkel in your book. I'm a drummer. I'm a big Russ Kunkel fan. But anyway, going back to that, do you not mention that guy's name in the book? Am I wrong? Mark?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, the killer.
Oh, I don't mention his name in my book. I don't mention it in my discussion, and I haven't ever since it happened. I don't believe in giving him the publicity that he was after, so I will not say it, and I will not write it ever.
I think Yoko had said for his own safety, he shouldn't be able to get out and all this stuff. And and remember when I mentioned his name in a video, it rearranged the way I thought about the whole thing. I went, oh yeah, Yeah. Why do I don't have, everyone knows, if you're interested, most people who are Beatles fans know it's not necessary. But you do mention him asking you if you had an autograph, or so you ran into him.
Yeah, he asked me the same questions over and over, bugged the crap out of me. I wanted to smack him just because he was bothering me so much and following me down the sidewalk. And I wish to this day, because it caused so much guilt for all these years afterwards, that I had gone to the security department at the Dakota and said, this guy is bothersome. Get rid of him. He shouldn't be here. He's bugging people. And maybe they would have. Maybe they would have called the police. Maybe they would have seen that he had a gun in the pocket of his coat, which I didn't. So it's just, that's something that's always made me sad ever since.
But Laura, that the fact that you're second guessing that says that you're a good person. I mean, I really mean that, person to person, that you feel that way. But the other side of it is there's how would you know how, like, really? Because the world is filled with people. Even before you met him, I'm sure you met tons of other people who are through the years that are a little left or right of center, and you go, I mean, I appreciate you put that in the book, and I understood that, and I'm going, but how would you know? I mean,
it's just the way I've always felt since.
Yeah.
The guilt has sat on my shoulders and on my head for 43 years, and it always will. I try and make myself feel better, but unfortunately, I can't when it comes to that.
Yeah. When I found out about you, and I thought, oh my God, I got to be friends with this lady. And I remember the first thought I had that day. The first thought, it was a selfish thought. And a lot of people have shared that with me. They said, well, oh, there won't be a Beatles reunion. It's of all the selfish things I could have thought, I went, oh, wow, that says a lot about me, when I found out that he had passed. And I didn't watch football. I didn't hear Howard Cosell say that thing on. But what about you? I mean, were you still in New York when it happened? You must have been still in New York.
I was. The rest of my RKO team left and went back to the West Coast that night. And on the way, dropped John and Yoko off at the recording studio because they needed a ride, because their own limo had just canceled out on them or whatever. And so I said goodbye to them, and we hugged, and we made plans to meet for dinner in a couple weeks in San Francisco when they were going to be there. And I was so excited, and turned around to go have dinner with a friend of mine who had just moved to New York, an old friend of mine from San Francisco. And I was going to spend the night in New York also. The minute I turned around was when I started getting bugged by the creep. And when I finally got away from him and went to my friend's office and told him about my incredible day, I was just thrilled, and just, I wanted to call everybody I knew and tell them about the best day of my life. It was so amazing. And we had dinner, and I was really hungry because I hadn't eaten for quite a while. And we went back to his apartment afterwards. And as he opened the door, I heard the radio on. And he said, oh, yeah, I leave the radio on because I don't want anybody to break in. I want them to think that I'm home. So if they hear the radio, they'll leave. And the minute he said that, a news person came on the radio saying, oh, John Lennon has been shot and he's at the Roosevelt Hospital. And I gasped. I almost fainted. I ran out into the middle of the street, caught a cab, went to the hospital, and there was a big glass door on the front of the hospital, and I could see right through it. There was Yoko sobbing hysterically and hugging somebody who I didn't recognize. And I looked at her, and I realized, as much as I wanted to go in and say, oh, Yoko, I'm so sorry, please let me know what I can do to help, that she was crying so hard and so upset that John hadn't just been shot, that John was fatally shot. And I just knew that just looking at her. So I didn't want to make her feel worse, because I would have just reminded her basically of that afternoon and how sad it was. And I immediately went to the phone booth right outside the hospital and called the RKO radio network executive who had been my news director at KFRC in San Francisco, and Joe Interante. And she said, come immediately to the RKO office. And I did. And I spent the night there doing interviews. And of course, then the news confirmed that John had been killed. And unfortunately, I'd been correct, which was really awful. And I stayed up all night doing interviews all over the country, the world. And then the next morning, they put me on the Today Show, which was really awful. And then after that, I went back to the West Coast, and I stayed in San Francisco, and it took me about a day and a half, almost 2 days, to listen to the interview, to write the special that, instead of originally airing in February, which it was going to be, an RKO Valentine's Day love special about double fantasy, it became John Lennon, the Man, the Memory, which is the name I gave it, and a 3-hour special that aired 6 days following John's assassination. And then after that, I went back to LA and basically lived in guilt and all of that for so long, and always have.
You know, I understand when people say things like, well, I just saw him yesterday, or I just talked to her like half an hour ago. I understand that, because human beings have problems with death. It's hard to it's such a complex thing. It's such a surreal. I mean, it's, did you feel, I mean, there must have been, your mind must have been, because the mind boggles itself going, what do you mean he's dead? I just talked to him. And I understand why people say that now. People, whenever I do an obituary on someone, they'll go, yeah, but I just saw him in concert. Yeah, well, everyone's alive the day before they're dead. But there's that thing. It made me think about that crazy thing that happens in our brains when someone, isn't there a little bit of that happens? Well, yeah, but I just talked to him. How could he be dead? Like,
I was horrified. But to be very honest, like I said, seeing Yoko sobbing hysterically and holding on to who I later found out was David Geffen in the hospital, that spelled it out for me. Then I knew that's what had happened. And when I did see later that evening on the news that they had arrested the killer who admitted it, I knew it was that guy. I knew it was going to be him, the one who had confronted me. And I was just feeling horrible about that.
I read your book. I mean, you did a lot. You were a true fan. You know, I always go, it's not luck, but sometimes luck plays a little bit in some of the things you do. I admire what you do. You obviously do it really well. Have you ever thought of your role in history? And I mean, you had a responsibility, and you would have been, listen, you had to write that book. The book you just wrote, you had to write that. That had to be said. People, how do you look at your role in all of this?
Well, that's why over the years, 43 years now, people have constantly said to me, when are you writing your book? And either I had so much guilt sitting on my head that I couldn't do it, or I was so busy with my career, or both. It wasn't about to happen. And then finally, when the pandemic hit, my TV production career basically came to a close, because TV production came to a close. And I had time all of a sudden, and I started thinking, gee, maybe I should use it to sit down and write. And I did. And I immediately started writing and got a literary agent who was very, very encouraging for just a couple of months, and then finally said, no, you know what? It doesn't matter how good your book is. Publishers aren't going to be interested in memoirs that aren't celebrity memoirs. So I can't represent you anymore. So I had to go about finding my own publisher, which I was lucky enough to do, because I'm not into self-publishing. That's not my thing at all. And I was able to find a very, very complimentary publisher that has been good for me. And my book actually was destined to be released on December 8th, 2023, the 43rd anniversary. And the cool thing is, my publisher actually got it printed a bit earlier and released a number of my books to people who'd ordered it from them, pre-ordered it. And so I've gotten a lot of good reviews actually already, people reading it and saying, yeah, I really liked it. So my book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, my life leading up to John Lennon's last interview, has paid off. You know, I didn't do it for the money. I did it to tell my story.
Yeah.
And it enabled me to do that.
By the way, that picture, someone had mentioned to me, it's like, you know how people are these days. They go, oh, Yoko looks very solemn, and that they're like, oh, it's like she knew. I'm going, come on, people are allowed to not. I don't get people. I understand, like, it's right behind you there that she's serious, but I always find it funny how people go, oh, like the Breakfast in America Twin Towers thing from Supertramp. They'll go, oh, they knew. I'm going, come on, no, stop looking at things that. But she does look serious in that picture.
I can explain why. And that is, they were at the end of our interview is when we took the pictures, and they were ready to go to what was going to be their recording session. And they were eager to see Jack Douglas and work with him and get their, you know, what they were working on, second album, third album, all that stuff out. And it was very exciting. And the thing is that they were going to be running late if they didn't leave soon. So Yoko was a little eager to get going at that point. And, you know, we'd already spent quite a few hours together. So it had been a great day.
Annie Leibovitz. So there you were, and John wasn't. So did you run into her again?
No, thank goodness I didn't.
Yeah.
And hopefully never will. She was very rude to me when I had a meetup with her in Seattle the year before, or year or so before. And when I heard that John and Yoko were shooting photos with her before our interview on December 8th, I was a little freaked out because I thought, oh my God, if she comes down with them, what am I going to do? How am I not going to smack her, you know? But thank God that didn't happen.
It's interesting. You said, John comes down later. Yoko's there first. John comes down, and you say, can't you see we're in the middle of an interview here to John Lennon?
Well, the funny thing is we'd been with Yoko for about a half an hour. I'd been talking to her all about the double fantasy songs and how they were basically dialogues between her and John, which was tremendous. And then when John, all of a sudden, the door opened about an inch, and I saw his nose sticking through the door and his glasses, and he walked in and started to apologize for being late. And I, smart ass that I am, said under my breath, can't you see we're in the middle of an interview? And he started laughing and just thought that was hysterical, and came in and sat down next to me on the love seat where I was sitting. And I was in awe, because who would have ever thought that I'd get to sit next to John Lennon on a love seat, and that throughout the rest of the afternoon, he would look at me and validate my comments and be so complimentary. And the cool thing was, he would, you know, do the typical John Lennon thing of taking his glasses, pushing them down his nose, looking at me over and saying, exactly, yes, love, that kind of thing. And it just made me feel tremendous, and still does to this day.
What was his energy like to you? I mean, I know beyond, whenever I ask this question, sometimes people say, well, I had to get beyond that. Oh my God, this that person. I don't know if I could really read him, but because, you know, the people I interview, the people you interview, they're fans as well, right? They're all fans. No matter how big someone is, there's someone they love. But how was it for you personally?
Well, as a huge fan, it was tremendous. I mean, I not only was sitting there thinking of all the questions that I'd come up with, and that also Dave Sholin was asking as well, but I was just in awe. I kept looking at him and Yoko and thinking, I'm spending the day with these people. They're becoming my friends. And I really, truly did feel that we had so much in common in a way that we were going to be friends for life. I was hopeful and very sure of that. And when we made plans at the end of the interview to all get together for dinner, I thought, oh, well, that's just the first of it. Then I can talk about all the things that we didn't talk about in the interview and do everything from get relationship advice, how to have a great relationship, to talk about everything John and I had in common that he brought up and that I wanted to mention, was part of my life as well. And it was exciting.
That's what happens with good interviews sometimes, where unbeknownst to anybody, the interviewer or the interviewee, sometimes and it's only happened a few times in 40 years for me, but sometimes at the end of the interview, and you know this, at the end of the interview, someone will say, give me your number, even because I'm all Zoom, right? I don't have numbers, backup numbers sometimes. But at the end of the interview, sometimes you go, I never thought of this as being a fringe benefit of doing an interview, of going, oh, I'm going to be past the fame thing, where I'm actually going to get to know the person. And what you just described is exactly that, of going, no, this is a connection.
Yes, I definitely felt that we had made a lifelong I definitely felt that we had made what was going to be a lifelong connection.
Yeah.
And in a way, despite the fact, of course, that John was killed, the connection was made because I still think about him all the time.
There you go. So you had grapefruit. You had your own copy going into the interview, Yoko's book.
Well, that was something that I just knew that I had to bring with me because I'd had the book for a few years. I loved the book. And when I brought it, and I was alone with Yoko talking to her about it before John came in, she kept saying, oh my God, this is amazing that you would have a copy. And even John, when he came, said, we haven't seen a copy of this for years. This is incredible. And later when Yoko said, oh, I want to autograph your book for you, John said, oh, please, can I autograph it too? Because he explained that he had written the introduction, which it said on the cover, which of course I knew. And I said, yes, of course, autograph it. And he did. They both did. Yoko gave me a loving autograph, and John autographed and also drew a cartoon of the two of them. And it's possibly my number one possession in my life all these years later.
Have you ever been offered any money for that? I'm curious.
Yes, of course, but no, I wouldn't take it.
Yeah. It's almost like a piece of you, right? I always say some of the stuff I've got, I'm going, sell it when I'm gone, but don't sell it now.
Because I have it right here.
Oh, really? Oh my God. Is that actually it?
This is the copy. These are the autographs.
That's amazing. What a moment in time, huh?
Yes, and when I bought the book 4 years before I'd even started working in radio, if anybody had said, well, in 4 years, you're going to be sitting there with the author waiting for her amazing husband, John Lennon, I would have laughed and said, yeah, right. Tell me another story. But it worked out.
Yeah. To you, John Lennon, who was John Lennon to you? Who, after having spent, he gave you, I don't know, how long was it?
Hours. We spent the entire afternoon there. And he was friendly and validating and complimentary. He was a wonderful human being, my hero, my idol. And before that, I interviewed George Harrison 2 years before.
Yeah.
And that interview was amazing. And the time I spent with George was so incredible because I was so in awe of him and his knowledge and interest in India, and all of that just fascinated me. And it was so amazingly beautiful to be able to speak with him after the birth of his son Danny and just after his marriage to Olivia. And then about 6-7 months later, to get to go to London with my RKO team, Dave Sholin and Ron Hummel, our producer engineer, and interview Paul McCartney and Linda, who was wonderful. Tragic. I was so very sad when she passed away. And their latest lineup of Wings, that was great time spent as well. He was so funny, and they were just such a great couple, and so obviously thrilled about being able to perform together and raising their children. And so our meetup with John and Yoko about a year and a half later, he emphasized a lot of the same things that Paul had, about getting to make music with Yoko being so incredible, and how that was how he wanted to do live shows with Yoko, be with her, nobody else necessarily. And
did you get it with Paul and John, though? Did you get that kind of synchronistic sort of, here they are both working with their wives, in spite of maybe fans not wanting them to, especially with Yoko, because she got a lot of flack. But even Linda did. But here they are. They found someone, a comrade in life. Was there a sort of a synchronistic thing? Did you get it with John and Paul? I mean, obviously, they don't have to prove themselves. It's John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but...
Yes, they both, as I said, were so thrilled about being with their wives, not just living at home and having that aspect, but also being able to be in the studio and being able to do interviews and being able to go on stage, with John thinking about going on stage, and Paul, of course, already talking about being on stage with Linda, and that was amazing. And John had done that before with Yoko, but they were talking about now with Double Fantasy being released, the possibility of going on tour. And the idea was only if that was what they were going to concentrate on, their own music, Double Fantasy, and the albums that were coming up. He was very excited about that.
I like the story where you say you ran into Peter Tork and he asked you to be his special guest at the show. That is so cool.
Oh, right. Yes. Well, that was extremely unusual and that had been years before, when I, in the midst of my college days, when I was walking along an outside shopping center, basically, and there was a guy sitting on one of the stands outside and called to me, and I looked at him and I thought, oh my God, he looks so familiar. And it was Peter Tork, because I'd been a Monkees fan, years earlier, and he'd changed a lot over the years. And we started talking, and he mentioned that he was part of a benefit show at the Troubadour that night. And if I wanted to come, he would put me on his guest list. And I said, yeah, sure. And it was an amazing show. It was him and Linda Ronstadt and some of the Eagles and Jackson Browne, and it was a very memorable show. It was very cool.
Tell me about KFRC. Mentioned a lot, big part of your life.
KFRC AM Top 40 was not just RKO's amazing radio station, but it was Billboard's #1 Top 40 station in the country for a number of years. And so getting an internship while I was a student in journalism at UC Berkeley there was amazing. And it gave me the excuse to drop out of college when they offered me a full-time job as a news editor, because the news director there, Joe Interrante, was very complimentary about my ability and could see me as becoming a great news person. And so I started working there and full time. And the amazing thing was when Dave Sholin, who was the music director there, wanted to do a Beatles special for RKO and had me go pick up the tapes that had been recorded with them, the interview tapes on KHJ years before, because he knew I was from LA and asked me if when I went back there, I would go pick up the tapes for him. And so I immediately went and did. And he asked Joe to write the special, but she said, no, I'm too busy. I'm the news director. I have kids to raise. Ask Lori. And I was in awe that she had that much, idea that how I would be so great at it. And Dave said, sure. And so I immediately did and got credit, writer, co-producer of what turned out to be the longest Beatles special on the radio in the United States. It was called RKO Presents the Beatles. And then eventually, when it was syndicated a couple of years later, and we got to expand it to first 15 hours and then 17 hours, and we got to change the name to the title that I came up with, which was The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And I'm always very complimentary about titles that I come up with. So that was very exciting, and I still like listening to it.
Is there anybody who surprised you the most when you interviewed them?
Well, in a way, I guess that would be John and Yoko, because John, as I mentioned, was so incredibly not just encouraging, but complimentary, and just had such great things to say and call me love and say exactly, and you're right, and just look at me, and acted like he liked my comments and my language. And that was amazing to me. I mean, I'd always had great interviews, had a wonderful time doing interviews, and great responses from everybody from Linda Lovelace, the porn star, to Beatles producer George Martin. Everybody was a wonderful interview, especially George Martin. He was great. But just hearing John compliment me so much in person was thrilling. And to come from an interviewee right on the spot was great. Another thing was Paul McCartney also was complimentary and sang to me, and that was really cool. And I had a great time there too with him and Linda.
What was your impression of George Martin?
George was not only so amazing to talk to about his work with the Beatles, and the surprising thing about how much money he actually didn't make right from the start working with them, but he just had so much fun with them and loved getting to know them and work with them, and was so very happy that their last project together was, as he said, basically, a good ending, a good way to end the Beatles band. So that was great to hear.
Well, he's talking about Abbey Road.
Yes, and basically how wonderful it was to get the final call from Paul saying, please, we want to do one more album. Will you work with us? Yeah. So he was thrilled about that.
Yeah. Who owns, by the way, I was talking to my ex-boss, and we were talking about a little memory stick that I have, which is 20 years. It's not this one. 20, because it's audio, right? So MP3s are very small. I have it's down here someplace. Oh, it's right here. There's 20 years of interviews on this one memory stick. Wow. Because it's MP3s. And one day someone asked me, who owns your interviews? I'm going, well, no, radio guys, we own our interviews. It's our interviews. Because when radio stations get sold, they don't say, where are the interviews? They don't ask for that. They don't care. And I talked to G. Brown from the Denver Post. I don't know if you know him, a little while ago. and he just wrote a book on. And I said, "Where's your interviews? Do you have your interviews? Do you have one of these?" He says, "No, I would take the cassette and I would record the last interview, re-record on top of the last interview because it was for print, and we didn't know about the future and having." So, do you have your interviews?
Well, the interviews that I did in the 70s were basically done on reel to reel. And although some of them I had done onto cassette as well, made onto cassette, re-recorded. A lot of those I do have, but they weren't radio station interviews. They were RKO network interviews, which means that RKO owned the shows that they came from. And that's a whole other legal thing. So I have to be very careful. And also, unfortunately, over the years, having moved around the country so much, possessions got lost, tape boxes got lost by moving companies. And, that's very sad. And also with huge earthquakes here in LA, I've lost a bunch of things that got destroyed. So unfortunately, I don't have everything. I like to think that I have most, but I'd have to count them to make sure.
Are there, and I mean this sincerely, after reading the book, there was a part of me of going, I want more. I want to go down this journey more with you. That's a small part of your life. So would you consider writing more?
I absolutely am considering writing a second edition, a memoir edition, because there's so much more career-wise that I did, not just music related, but TV production as well that might be of interest. And then there's just so much story of what went on with my life and all of that stuff. So yes, it's a possibility. But to be honest, I want to spend a lot of time going through this book, my number one book, and getting people to know my original story first. That's the most important thing. And I'm hoping to be able to do a lot of traveling and signing and other sessions all over the country, hopefully all over the world. I'm really hoping to go to London and Liverpool and to meet up with people and sign my book for them there. So we'll see if I'm able to do that. That's something I'm working on.
Oh yeah, I really hope so. Yeah, if anybody belongs to be there, I mean, really, you do. Do you ever stop and again, incoming cliche question is there must be a part of you that looks back and goes, it's been a hell of a run. I run into radio guys all the time who go, yeah, I'm friends with these people, I'm friends with those people, but then, and they're not. But then there's those people who get inside of rooms, and after the interview, they'll hear, hey, this was fun. I enjoyed this. This is, and they mean it. They don't tell that to everybody. And you're very good at what you do. There must be a part of you that says, this has been you do the work, you get in the room. That's what you did. You did the work. You went to the Dakota because you did the work, because you deserve to be there. How do you feel looking back at your career that way?
I feel that I was very, very lucky that I was in the right place at the right time in terms of getting to not just be in a newsroom, but getting to do music and rock specials for RKO. It was just all perfect being at KFRC, the big top 40 RKO rock radio station, and get to work with everyone from Joe Interrante to Dave Sholin to Ron Hummel. These were all people who helped me become what I became. And I have so much thanks for them all, and I realize that had they not all been there, who knows, maybe my life wouldn't have been anywhere near as cool.
You're meeting a lot of people now who read your book, who want to read your book, who want to get it autographed, who just want to see you. What do they ask you the most? What's the big question you get the most?
They want to know what John was like, basically. I mean, you can't blame them. There are so many John Lennon fans who tell me, oh my God, it was so horrible that night when I heard that he'd been killed. And, whether they were watching football and found out that way, or were listening to the radio and found out that way. And they were all so horrified. So, of course, it's important to them to hear what happened hours before, which is when I was with them. So that's something they all mention.
What do you think he'd be doing? I hate to throw that one at you, but to me, when I found out about Double Fantasy, I loved the fact that he was recording more than I loved the album. I didn't hate the album. I did like the album. But there was a part of me of going, oh my God, you could feel the rejoice. You could feel the fact that he was reinvigorated, that he was happy. Did you feel that from him? And what do you think he'd be doing now, you think? You think he'd still be doing it?
Well, that's hard to say, but my guess would be that yes, he'd still be writing music with Yoko, and he'd probably be writing and performing with Sean and Julian too. So that would be amazing.
Is there anything that you'd like to include that I haven't asked you?
Well, I just want to stress that my book is not a John Lennon bio. It's my memoir. And that means that not just description and quotes from my interview with John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison and Ramones and Talking Heads and so many others, but also the story of my life and career and the emphasis of sex and drugs and rock and roll in my life. So hopefully people will want to read that.
I like your chapter titles, by the way.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Come up with all the song titles that describe parts of my life.
Yeah, Love in the Elevator.
Awesome.
It's all good.
Such a pleasure to meet you.
It was fun. Take care of yourself.
It was. Hope everything sounds and looks good.
Oh, it's all great. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Hope you enjoyed that. Laurie Kay is such an interesting, wonderful, beautiful human being. And she was in New York interviewing John Lennon just a few hours before he was killed on December 8th, 1980. There'll be links in the description where you can pick up her book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper. If you want to make a donation to the channel, there are links to PayPal in the description for us. You can join our Patreon, get early access to our videos. Remember to subscribe to our channel, comment on the videos, like the videos, and share them on social media. I'm John Bowden. This is Rock History Book. Take care of yourself.